"Please, don't kick me. I'm already hurt," cried the waitress. Then Undercover CEO did this. What if a single moment of cruelty could become the catalyst for the most beautiful change in someone's life? Julia pressed her back against the cold brick wall behind Tony's diner, her uniform still damp from the coffee a customer had deliberately spilled on her just minutes before. At 34, she'd grown used to invisible bruises, the kind that came from working 3 jobs to keep her 8-year-old son fed and housed. Her hands shook as she wiped away tears, not from the burns on her arm, but from the customer's final words. "Maybe if you weren't so clumsy, you wouldn't be stuck serving people like me." She didn't know that inside the diner, a man in faded jeans and a simple button-down shirt had witnessed everything. David Chen, worth more than most small countries, had been sitting quietly in the corner booth, but what he'd just seen made his chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Julia had been working at Tony's diner for 8 months, ever since the factory where she'd assembled car parts for 6 years had closed down. The job barely covered rent on the tiny apartment she shared with her son, but it was honest work, and she'd learned long ago to find dignity in any labor that put food on their table. Most customers were kind enough: tired truckers who left decent tips, elderly couples who smiled when she refilled their coffee. But lately, there'd been more difficult ones, people who seemed to take pleasure in reminding her of her place. David had started coming to the diner 3 weeks ago, always ordering the same thing: black coffee and whatever pie was fresh that day. He dressed simply, drove an older pickup truck, and spoke softly when he ordered. Julia had pegged him as another working man, maybe a contractor or mechanic, someone who understood the value of a dollar. She'd noticed his calloused hands, the way he always said please and thank you, how he'd quietly leave a $20 bill for a $12 meal. What Julia didn't know was that David had been visiting diners and restaurants across the country for months, not as the CEO of Chen Industries, but as a man trying to understand the businesses he was considering acquiring. His company specialized in turning struggling establishments into thriving community centers, but he'd learned that spreadsheets couldn't tell him what he really needed to know about a place. He had to feel it, see how people treated each other when they thought no one was important was watching. The customer who'd humiliated Julia was a regular, a man named Frank who seemed to enjoy making the staff uncomfortable. David had watched this pattern for weeks: the deliberately spilled drinks, the snide comments about Julia's appearance, the way Frank would leave exact change, no tip, after making her clean up messes he'd created on purpose. Each incident had made David's jaw clench a little tighter, but tonight had crossed a line. As Julia stepped back inside, trying to compose herself, Frank was already gesturing impatiently for more coffee. "Hurry up," he called out. "And try not to spill it this time." The few other customers in the diner looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. That's when David quietly stood up from his corner booth, his decision already made. David walked slowly toward Frank's table, his footsteps deliberate and calm. Julia was already approaching with the coffee pot, her shoulders tense with anxiety. Frank looked up at David with annoyance. "What do you want?" "I'm trying to get some service here." "I've been watching you," David said quietly, his voice carrying a strength that made the entire diner go silent. "For weeks, I've watched you treat this woman with complete disrespect." His tone wasn't angry, it was something deeper, the kind of controlled disappointment that cut through noise better than any shout. Frank's face reddened. "Mind your own business, pal. If she can't handle the job, maybe she should find another one." He turned to Julia, who stood frozen with the coffee pot. "Well, are you going to pour, or not?" Julia's hands trembled as she began to tilt the pot. She'd endured this treatment because she needed this job desperately. Her son's school had sent home another notice about overdue lunch money just yesterday. The electric bill was past due. She couldn't afford to lose even 1 day's pay. But as she started to pour, David gently placed his hand over the cup. "No," he said simply. "Julia, you don't need to serve someone who treats you like you're less than human." He looked directly at Frank. "And you need to understand something. Every person in this diner has a story, has people who love them, has dreams and struggles just like you do. The difference is, most of us don't use our pain as an excuse to hurt others." Frank stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Who the hell do you think you are, talking to me like that? You're just some blue-collar nobody." David's expression remained calm, but something flickered in his eyes. "Maybe. But I know the difference between a man and a bully." He reached into his wallet and placed a $100 bill on Frank's table. "Your meals are covered for the next month. But here's the deal, you're going to start treating every person who works here with respect, or you're going to find somewhere else to eat." The diner remained completely silent. Julia felt tears welling up again, but this time they weren't from humiliation. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. She'd never had anyone stand up for her like this, defend her dignity when she couldn't defend it herself. Frank, clearly shaken and embarrassed, threw some money on the table and stormed out, muttering under his breath. But David wasn't finished yet. As the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Julia realized her hands were still shaking. She set the coffee pot down carefully and looked at David with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I could have handled it." David's expression softened. "I know you could have. You've been handling it for weeks. But just because you can endure something doesn't mean you should have to." He gestured toward the booth where he'd been sitting. "Could we talk for a few minutes?" Julia glanced toward the kitchen, where Tony was pretending not to watch while flipping burgers. He gave her a small nod. The dinner rush was over, and a few remaining customers seemed content to linger over their coffee. She followed David to his booth, sliding into the seat across from him. "I'm David," he said, extending his hand. "And I owe you an apology." "An apology? For what?" "For sitting here for 3 weeks, watching that man disrespect you, and not saying anything until tonight." David's voice carried genuine regret. "I've been coming here to understand this place better. I'm in the restaurant business, and I was considering making an offer to buy Tony's diner." Julia's heart sank. Another corporate buyer, another business that would probably close within months, leaving her jobless again. "Oh," she said quietly. David saw the fear flash across her face and quickly continued. "But what I've learned here isn't in any business plan. I've watched you work 3 different shifts, cover for other employees when they're sick, and treat every customer with kindness even when they don't deserve it. You remember how people like their coffee, you check on the elderly customers to make sure they're okay, and you do all of this while dealing with your own struggles." "How do you know about my struggles?" Julia asked, defensive. "Because I recognize them," David said gently. "I grew up in a house where my mother worked 3 jobs just like you do. I've seen that look in someone's eyes when they're counting every dollar, when they're exhausted but can't afford to rest." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." Then he continued, "Julia, what if I told you that you've already proven everything you need to prove? That watching you work has taught me more about leadership and dignity than any business school ever could." Julia stared at David, trying to process what he was telling her. "I don't understand. What do you mean you're in the restaurant business?" David reached into his wallet again, but this time he pulled out a simple business card. Julia read it twice before the words sank in. "David Chen, CEO, Chen Industries." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "I'm someone who believes that the best businesses are built on treating people right," David said simply. "And you've shown me exactly what that looks like." He leaned forward slightly. "Julia, I want to buy this diner, but I want to do it the right way. I want to turn it into something that honors the community it serves. And I want you to help me do it." "I don't know anything about running a business," Julia protested, but David shook his head. "You know everything about what matters. You know how to make people feel welcome, how to work hard, how to care about others even when you're struggling yourself." His voice grew more earnest. "I'm offering you a partnership, Julia. Not just a job, a real stake in making this place everything it could be." Julia felt her world shifting beneath her feet. "I can't. I mean, I have a son, and I've never. She stopped, overwhelmed. Your son is exactly why this could work, David said gently. Every decision we make will be about creating the kind of place where families like yours can thrive. Better wages, healthcare, profit sharing, college funds for employees' children. He paused. I've been looking for someone who understands what it means to build something real, something that matters. Watching you work these past weeks, seeing how you treat people, how you never give up, that's exactly what I've been searching for. Tears started flowing down Julia's cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were tears of hope. Why me? You could have anyone. Because anyone can manage numbers on a spreadsheet, David replied. But not everyone has a heart that sees people the way you do. Not everyone understands that the most important part of any business is how it makes people feel about themselves. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. He reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. Julia, what would you say if I told you that in 6 months, you could be the general manager of the finest community restaurant in 3 states? 6 months later, Julia stood in the completely renovated dining room of what was now called Julia's Table, watching her 8-year-old son, Michael, carefully arrange fresh flowers on each table. The transformation had been beyond anything she could have imagined. The old vinyl booths had been replaced with comfortable seating, the harsh fluorescent lights had given way to warm, welcoming fixtures, and the walls now displayed artwork from local artists, including a beautiful painting Michael had created of the diner's new garden. But the real changes went far deeper than decoration. Every employee now earned a living wage plus healthcare benefits. The staff included 2 other single mothers who'd been struggling to make ends meet, a retired teacher who wanted part-time work to stay active, and 3 teenagers saving for college with the help of the restaurant's education fund. Julia had discovered she had a natural gift for organizing, training, and inspiring others, skills that David had recognized in her long before she'd seen them in herself. Tony had stayed on as head cook and part owner, his traditional recipes now complemented by seasonal specials that Julia had developed by listening to customers' stories about their grandmother's cooking. The restaurant had become exactly what David had envisioned, a true community center where people came not just for food, but for connection. The customer board by the entrance was filled with thank you notes, job postings, and offers of help from neighbors. Julia had started a program where customers could buy meals for those in need, no questions asked. The wall of kindness, as Michael had named it, never stayed empty for long. David still came by regularly, though now he sat at the counter and let Julia serve him coffee while they discussed expansion plans. 3 other communities had already inquired about opening their own Julia's Table locations, each one to be run by someone with Julia's heart for service and understanding of what it meant to struggle. As Julia watched Michael help seat an elderly couple at their favorite table by the window, she remembered that night 6 months ago when she'd stood outside in the cold, feeling invisible and defeated. She thought about how one person's willingness to see her dignity had changed not just her life, but the lives of everyone who walked through these doors. Frank had never returned to the restaurant, but Julia often wondered if he'd learned something that night too. She hoped he had. She discovered that carrying resentment was too heavy a burden when there was so much joy to be found in building something beautiful. David appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked. "Just thinking about how everything can change in a moment," Julia said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "How one person choosing kindness can create ripples that reach further than they'll ever know." "That's what you do every day," David replied. "You create those ripples." If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of how ordinary people create extraordinary change. Thank you for joining us on Julia's journey, and remember, sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply see each other's worth.